Hello, everyone. Hi, I see you attendees coming in. As we wait for people to join us, we will start slowly introducing today's seminar, today's conversation between our guests, Michael Rothberg, Vijaya Teelock, and Professor Ananya Kabir. We are quite a few people today attending. We're very pleased with this. I sense that, again, it will take some time for everyone to get in the room. But so let me first introduce myself. My name is Luca Raimondi. I am a Marie Curie Research Fellow, Global Research Fellow, based at King's College London and at the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa. And I am here with my colleagues from the University of Mauritius and also King's College London, who are my two collaborators on the Archipelagic, I was falling down the chair, on the Archipelagic Memory project. We will speak about that and introduce that in a minute. But let me introduce my colleague, Dr. Shivani Rajkumar, who is a lecturer in English and Cultural Studies at the University of Mauritius, and Linganadan Murdy, or Elvin, for us friends, who is a lecturer in international relations at the University of Mauritius, and he's also now based at King's College London at the African Leadership Center, where he's completing a PhD. We also want, before we start, to thank the people, the institutions that support us today, but also in our project. First of all, our three universities, King's College London, the University of Mauritius, and the University of Witwatersrand, and also our funders and sponsors, the European Union through the Marie Curie Slodowska program, the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung, Southern Africa, the IFAS, South African French Institute, IFAS Research, Institut Français Afrique du Sud, but the research part of that, which is also based in Johannesburg, South Africa, the Postcolonial Studies Association, the UNESCO Slave Route Project, the Memory Studies Association, and the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center. We also want to note that today is a very symbolical day. 1st of February is the day when Mauritius commemorates today its 187th anniversary of the abolition of slavery. And so we felt that it was a really topical day for us to meet. And we're very happy, again, that you were able to join across all over the world and different time zones. I will now leave the floor to my colleague Shivani, who will introduce the seminar. Just to remind the title, it is Conceptualizing Archipelagic Memory, an online seminar with Michael Rothberg, Vijaya Teelock, in conversation with Ananya Kabir. So Shivani, over to you.
Thank you very much, Luca, and my greetings to everyone. Before I start talking about the seminar, I just wanted to let you know a little bit about the project, the Archipelagic Memory project, which is a collaboration between three universities, the University of Mauritius, King's College London, and the University of Witwatersrand. And as advertised widely, this seminar is the curtain-raising event of the Archipelagic Memory project. You may know that we intended its kickoff event to be the International Conference Archipelagic Memory, Intersecting Geographies, Histories and Disciplines. Twice postponed due to the pandemic, the conference seeks to take the Indian Ocean as principal site, where researchers, artists, and cultural practitioners working on archipelagic spaces and memory convene to investigate new meanings and experiences of the archipelagic, as well as instigate a theoretical dialogue on memory production in archipelagos, and by the same token, contribute new conceptual tools to memory studies. We are delighted to inform you that the conference is going ahead this year as an in-person event, and that the call for papers in English and French is now available from our website, which is archipelagicmemory.wordpress.com. The conference will be held from the 7th to the 4th of August at the University of Mauritius. Our confirmed keynote speakers are Professor Ananya Kabir from King's College London, Professor Steph Krabs from Ghent University, Dr. Anwar Janu, retired senior lecturer from the University of Mauritius, Professor George Abungu, archaeologist and international heritage consultant, and Harry Gauthier, Indo-Malagasy novelist based at Oslo. We're very pleased that some of them, along with valued members of our scientific committee, are present with us today. Yet, and in anticipation of the conference, we decided to make the best of one of the biggest lessons learned from the pandemic, that the virtual world can still create a sense of community and an intellectual forum. Today's seminar aims to be the first step in the laying of definitional groundwork on archipelagic memory through a public conversation between three scholars whose works have been key to our own investigations: Professor Michael Rothberg, Associate Professor Vijaya Teelock, and Professor Ananya Kabir herself. My colleague Linga Nadan will now introduce our speakers, and I thank you very much for your kind attention.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for attending this webinar. We will now call our guests to join the panel while I introduce them. Michael Rothberg is chair of the Department of Comparative Literature, professor of English and Comparative Literature, and the 1939 Society Samuel Gotts Chair in Holocaust Studies at UCLA. He is the author of the widely influential monograph, Multidirectional Memory, Remembering the Holocaust in the Age of Decolonization, which has been translated into French, German, and Polish. Michael's other books include The Implicated Subject, Beyond Victims and Perpetrators, and Traumatic Realism, The Demand of Holocaust Representation. With Yasmin Yildiz, he is currently completing Inheritance Trouble, Migrant Archives of Holocaust Remembrance for Fordham University Press. Vijaya Teelock is retired Associate Professor of History at the University of Mauritius. She is currently a member of the International Scientific Committee of the UNESCO Slave Route Project and the Vice President of the International Scientific Committee of the Indentured Labor Route Project. She was formerly the Vice Chairperson of the Mauritian Truth and Justice Commission and Joint Director of the Zanzibar International Ocean Research Institute. Vijaya is the author of, amongst others, Bitter Sugar, Sugar and Slavery in the 19th Century Mauritius and Mauritian History from its beginning to modern times. She has been awarded the highest distinct Order of Merit in the honor system of Mauritius, the Grand Commander of Order of the Star and Key of the Indian Ocean. Ananya Kabir is a professor of English literature at King's College London. She is currently heading the Creole India project, and she is a co-founder of with Harry Gauthier of the online cultural platform Tinai Creole, promoting the vision of a plural and creolized India. Her book publication include Partition Post-Amnesia, 1947-1971, and Modern South Asia, and Territory of Desire, representing the Valley of Kashmir. For her groundbreaking work in the humanities, she has been awarded the Infosys Humanities Prize by the Infosys Science Foundation India and the Humboldt Prize by the Alexander von Humboldt Stiftung Germany. As lead member of the scientific committee of the Archipelagic Memory Conference, and due to her current extensive research on memory and conceptualization of the archipelagic, Ananya will be the facilitator of the conversation in today's webinar. Ananya, I leave the floor to you.
Thank you, Elvin, Shivani, and Luca, and welcome to everyone who has gathered here. We hope that the weather in Mauritius is not going to prevent us from communing with Vijaya because there is a tropical storm either on its way or already landed. So this is truly an archipelagic, atmospheric phenomenon that we are captive to. So we very much hope that Vijaya is going to, I know she's connected, but she's having some problems maybe with the video, but we will manage. We always do. And in the meanwhile, it's really an extreme pleasure to have everybody here and have in conversation with me, my dear colleagues and friends, Michael Rothberg and Vijaya Teelock, who I believe are meeting on screen for the first time. And I am delighted that we are able to bring the two of you together. My job really is to start the conversation and make the connections. So let me just begin with a little preamble to warm us up. We have gathered to think about to conceptualize indeed archipelagic memory. But what is it? Let me start with a poem that I think we all know pretty well. Yes, in the sea of life enisled, with echoing straits between us thrown, dotting the shoreless, watery wild, we mortal millions live alone. The islands feel the enclasping flow, and then their endless bounds they know. But when the moon their hollows lights, and they are swept by balms of spring, and in their glens on starry nights, the nightingales divinely sing, and lovely notes from shore to shore across the sounds and channels pour. Oh, then a longing like despair is to their farthest caverns sent, for surely once they feel we were part of a single continent. Now round us spreads the watery main. Oh, might our marges meet again. This is the Victorian poet Matthew Arnold's poem, Isolation, to Marguerite continued. Arnold imagines the alienated modern condition as quintessentially island-like. We are separated not only from each other, but from a wholeness that for Arnold was once continental. In place of the memory of connection, there is a feeling that there should be a memory. All there is instead is a longing like despair, an urgent but vague desire to restore a wholeness that the watery plain destroys. Whatever archipelagic memory may be, I don't think it's this sense of disconnect and despair. And it is not predicated by what Arnold in his final stanza calls the unplumbed, salt, estranging sea. This sea separates islands in Arnold's vision. In contrast, let me bring us to the late Epeli Haufa, Pacifica thinker, who might indeed have been speaking back to Arnold when he declares in his famous essay, Sea of Islands. Epeli Haufa says, there is a gulf of difference between viewing the Pacific as islands in a far sea and a sea of islands. So by making us think about a sea of islands, Haufa shifts our perspective from the small islands of the Pacific to the vastness of that watery plain within which the islands are both integrated and integral to. Oceania, says Haufa, is expanding. Oceania is hospitable and generous. It is humanity rising from the depths of brine and regions of fire deeper still. Oceania is us, he says. Epeli Haufa not only impels us to stop viewing island lives and island worlds as isolated and ineffective because they may be small, he actually effects a shift from the canon of English literature to which Arnold's poetry belongs to epistemologies outside of Europe and the North Atlantic continental conjuncture. Archipelagic theory assembles itself from that decontinental, deterritorializing position, as excellently demonstrated, for example, by Brian Russell Roberts and Michelle Ann Stevens in the edited volume on archipelagic American studies. And there are many whose work feeds into our growing sense of the archipelagic as some kind of a lever. Not coincidentally, such thinkers often emerge from archipelagic locations. Islands do not automatically aggregate into archipelagos. There is a connective logic that needs to be applied. And this logic often arises from lived experience in archipelagic worlds. So Edward Glisson with his concept of rhizomatic relationality, Brathwaite with his subterranean unity, Antonio Benitez Rojo with his repeating islands, and Derek Walcott with his map on which there are more islands than peas on a tin plate. This is from Schooner Flight. archipelagic thinking would want to put these poets and theorists from the Caribbean in relation, not just to each other, but thinkers from other oceanic worlds. And this is in a way a trans-archipelagic theoretical turn. And this is the thinker Otmar Etter's term, the trans-archipelagic. And this turn has so far put Pacific and Atlantic Caribbean worlds together, for example, beautifully by our colleague Elizabeth DeLaury, who remaps what she calls island heterotrophy to generate, in her words, a materialist archipelagraphy. I hope I have pronounced that the way it's meant to be, archipelagos. You know, we keep generating terminologies and I'm not quite sure how they are to be pronounced, but you know what we are talking about. It's like historiography only about archipelagos, and probably therefore a different kind of thing altogether. Now, the next step then is to integrate these moves with the exciting new thalassology that is a frame, that is a phrase from Isabel Hofmeyr. And the next step then is to integrate these moves into the new thalassology that has emerged since from the Indian Ocean world. And what are we doing but exactly this? By bringing in Vijaya Teelock with her wealth of experience in memorialization work conducted from the perspective of her island of Mauritius in the Mascarene archipelago of the Western Indian Ocean. And in asking Dr. Teelock to engage in conversation with Professor Michael Rothberg, we are very deliberately taking archipelagic thinking to memory studies. Because what I've been talking about, the archipelagic theory I've been outlining, has thought theoretically, but not, and implicitly about memory, but not directly. And that's what we want to do. In Bill Ashcroft's words, archipelagos challenge binary thinking. And archipelagic consciousness makes us aware of collectivity and interconnectivity of other islands, and then Bill Ashcroft says, parenthetically, and hence other subjects in society. By bringing Vijaya and Michael in conversation together today, we open up this parenthesis and make it central to archipelagic thinking, bringing together other subjects in society, subjects other to us. How do we become connected? Today, then, we want to use the expertise of our two guests and their work in and with memorialization to ask, what might archipelagic memory be? So, we can come back to an answer maybe after a bit of a conversation between the three of us. And on this note, then, I'm going to actually try to throw out some questions to the two of you. I'm hoping that Vijaya is with us. Maybe, let me check, can we see her? And maybe somebody can tell me if she is there and can be seen. Fabulous. Okay, well, lovely. I will then welcome the two of you again, and I want to start by thinking about what both of you have done very effectively in your respective work. Demonstrate something which we may call the entanglement of memories. Vijaya, you have worked both with the legacies of slavery and with indenture in Mauritius and with the UNESCO. And Michael, you have coined for us an extremely useful phrase and idea, multi-directional memory, which by the very words we understand, it's about memories that go in different directions and perhaps then also come back entangled. So let's start with this idea of entangled memories. Vijaya, if you are there, could I ask you to perhaps tell us a little bit about your experience working with both these issues on such an important day for the history of slavery and its abolition in Mauritius, as our colleagues on the organizational side have reminded us. Vijaya, over to you.
Thank you so much, Ananya, Michael, Mr. Murde, and Shivani, for giving me the opportunity. I'm far from being an expert on archipelagic memory or thinking. So forgive me if I don't use all the terminologies and the concepts and the theories. But I think I wanted to take up one issue quickly. You mentioned that you're not sure whether archipelagic thinking is necessarily archipelagic memory. And in the case of Mauritius, in the past decades, I would rephrase it in terms, I don't know if this is being too simplistic, but rephrase it in terms of a dysfunction between scholars on one hand, scholars in Mauritius, talking and researching about slavery and indenture, and memory, which seems to be, I may be wrong, but which is in this part of the world is mainly public memory or popular memory. And this dysfunction has been something we have struggled with as researchers, especially talking about slavery in Mauritius, and something we have tried to address. Whether we have been successful or not, that's up to people to judge, and the younger generation. Also, I think it's very important not to look at events. I've read many articles on memorialization of slavery and of indenture and competition and so on. But I think, speaking as a historian, of course, I don't think we should discuss, not now, but I mean, when you review the literature that has been, and the debates that have gone on, we should not be discussing events in a chronological vacuum. Changes in memory take place at particular moments in time. And we really need to understand those moments, the context of the moment, and why, you know, certain debates were held, why certain terms were used, and the feeling and the sentiments, emotions that existed at that time. I don't think we should subsume all events in one kind of abstract model, if you understand what I'm trying to say. So I just wanted to mention, as you've asked, a few historic moments as I see them over the 4 decades. And as far as conceptualization of this memory, I'll focus on slavery for now, and then we can talk about indenture a bit later. I'm going to go as far back as the 1960s. I don't know what the profile of the audience we have here today, but I think it's important to know that before the 1960s, there were very few researchers and scholars that even wanted to write or research the history of slavery. It was left up to the literary persons, poets, and so on. For example, Edouard Monique, who wrote about slavery in Mauritius. So in the 1960s, a very important event, a cyclone, as the one we have here, but far more devastating, took place. And many, what we'd call today Creole leaders, noticed the discrepancy in the kind of assistance that was given to people of Creole descent in Mauritius. So it was the cyclone couple. And that sparked off a movement among the Michel brothers to try and ask for better conditions of living for people of African and Malagasy descent, and the whole reparations movement and debate started at that time. Even though they were, in a sense, in a minority, there were huge, as you know, most of you know Mauritius, there's a huge institutional influences that countered the demands for reparations in the 60s and 70s, official religion, plantocracy, etc. By the 1980s, 20 years later, of course, the situation has changed somewhat. We have researchers, historians creating alternative histories, writing people's history of Mauritius. But the fear of talking about slavery still existed. I remember going to Le Monde village and trying to talk to people. I was doing a documentary at that time on Mauritian history, and I wanted just to talk about what people thought about the history of slavery, and the inhabitants just refused to say, no, we don't want, we're scared. Our bourgeois may, you know, dismiss us or whatever. So even the 1980s, which is not that far away, we even had a slavery conference, and there were only scholars present, no descendants. So this is what I talked about, the dysfunction that existed at that time, the scholarly community and people who were directly affected and descended from slavery. 1998, Elvin mentioned my book, Bitter Sugar. Again, at that time, people said, oh, this will never get published in Mauritius, but it was, except that many bookshops refused to stock it. So the book was mainly about showing the harshness of Mauritian slavery and countering the very, very pervasive myth at that time that slavery was mild in Mauritius. We tended at that time, and we still do, have a very romanticized view of slavery through the fictional works of Paul Virginie, for example. So it's only, I would say, in the new millennium, we had a public holiday devoted to the 1st of February. Research were funded, maroon archaeology, etc. Important debates began to be held on history, whose history and whose heritage. But that's also when I felt that what I'd call an ethnicization of the debate really began to take place on issues relating to heritage. So heritage very much related to memory. So whose memory and whose history are we promoting or encouraging? So ironically, discussion on preserving the slave or indentured heritage history occurred through two very emblematic sites in Mauritius, the Lemon mountain, which was considered a refuge for maroon slaves, and the Pravasigat, a site for the arrival of indentured laborers. It became a game for some, a competition, which site should become a World Heritage first, why was more attention being paid to one and not to the other, and so many issues. So there are, of course, some that promoted this cultural competition. So this is something probably we will be talking about. I don't know if that answers a little bit what you expected for this first session.
It's a great starting point, Vijaya, because you know, you've been very involved in, I mean, anybody who visits a place like Mauritius, I think we're instantly struck by the publicness of memory, you know, and you've been at the forefront of it all with your work with the different routes, shall we say. I mean, the other dimension which is striking to a visitor to the Western Indian Ocean, and I say even in places like Seychelles, is this appeal to the UNESCO. You know, there's a strong link there is a perception that a body like UNESCO can assist in, can work with the aspirations of certain groups on these islands to make public aspects of their memory. But as you say, the minute you start doing that, you step into some tricky areas, you step into some troubled waters. There are different groups with different memories, and that's the hub of what we want to talk about. Because you mentioned that people had a fear of talking about their own heritage. Others would perhaps deem it not necessary, or they would fear something else. I think this might be a good moment to bring in Michael, because after all, I think, Michael, in your work on multidirectional memory, although you were not talking about Mauritius, you were not talking about indenture or slavery, you were talking about other kinds of these kinds of dilemmas or even competitions in a way between memory, and how do we get past them? So maybe, Michael, you would like to tell us how you would respond to Vijaya's account of how she had to step across the minefield of public memory making in Mauritius.
Sure, thank you. Let me thank Shivani and Luca and Elvin for the invitation, and Ananya, it's great to be in contact with you again, and Vijaya, wonderful to meet you. And in thinking about this event and doing some reading, I've already learned quite a bit, but I did want to acknowledge that this is in some ways way beyond my usual fields of expertise. So I'm excited by the challenge of thinking about this new context, but I have to work my way into it, I think. And as I was thinking about this, I was thinking about my own sort of intellectual biography. And as I think I've said in other places, a really key moment for me was the publication of a book about a different ocean, not the Indian Ocean, but the Atlantic. And that was Paul Gilroy's book, The Black Atlantic, which appeared when I was in graduate school. And to me, this was really made an enormous difference in my own sort of intellectual trajectory. There's a lot to discuss about the book. I understand that it's coming from somewhere different from where we're trying to go today, I think, but for me, it was a really important starting point. Why was that? It was, I was thinking about it, and there are a few aspects of Gilroy's method and argument that really resonated with me. One was the sort of diasporic methodology of taking us beyond national contexts and thinking about the kinds of issues I think that interest all of us. Another was what he called his anti-essentialist account of identity, right? That identities are not simply given and then we do things because of our identities, but identities emerge on the basis of the sorts of practices that we do in their names. And that became very important to me when I was thinking about memory as well. And then finally, there was a comparative dimension that Gilroy brought in, especially in the last chapter of his book. And in some ways, this was the most important, where here is a book about the legacies of the Middle Passage and the traumatic break of slavery and its impact in a kind of diasporic across the Atlantic, as it were. But in the last chapter, he makes what to me remains a very moving and powerful connection to the Nazi genocide, right? And to think about trauma comparatively, traumatic histories comparatively. So in that case, between slavery and the Holocaust, without reducing them to the same. I was rereading this and struck by how insistent he is that this is not a challenging of the specificity or even uniqueness of these histories, but it's a way of sort of bringing them together. So that was a really important moment for me, intellectually, biographically. I just realized that the book was published in 1993, which was also a really important moment in the history, and I like Vijaya's point about the way we need to historicize these questions, in the history of Holocaust memory. It was called at the time by a news show in the US, the year of the Holocaust. It was the year that Schindler's List came out. It was the year that the US Holocaust Museum opened. It was the start really in the post-Cold War moment of a new sort of globalization of Holocaust memory. And I was working on the Holocaust at the time and eventually became interested in the question of memory and was struck in the aftermath of that moment of the 90s that there was a certain discourse precisely of competition going on. And I understood the stakes, but I also found it troubling, not just ethically or morally, that there are these people sort of this kind of conflict between differently victimized groups, but also intellectually. I wasn't satisfied with the explanations I saw for how memory conflict and competition worked. And what I saw was that on sort of both sides of the conflict, and the conflict was over, in a sense, the prominence of Holocaust memory in a public space, certainly in the US and in Europe at the very least, versus the memory of other histories like the history of slavery, but also prominently the history of colonialism more broadly. What I found was on both sides, if I could speak crudely in that way, there was a shared logic that I came to see as the logic of the zero-sum game, which said that if there's Holocaust memory, therefore we cannot have memory of slavery. If there's memory of slavery, the Holocaust is somehow going to get pushed out. I understood again why people were making these arguments, but it didn't strike me as a very good explanation of how public memory works. In fact, if we step back from the actors themselves, I think what we see is a more dynamic relationship, or what I came to see as a more dynamic relationship between these different historical memories. And so what I did in multidirectional memory is to go back and trace a kind of counter history or a genealogy of these more comparative, multi-directional forms of remembrance. And what I found is that you can go all the way back to the beginning, as it were, all the way back for Holocaust memory, that is, all the way back to the immediate post-war moment. And in fact, you can actually go back into the 30s and see a lot of Black intellectuals, for example, making connections of these sorts, but that's before the Holocaust. So, but immediately after the camps are liberated, the war is over, you see thinkers like Aimé Césaire, Hannah Arendt, W.E.B. Du Bois, André Schwartzbart in the Francophone tradition, the French Francophone tradition, Fanon is there too, all thinking these histories in relationship to each other. And I found I could trace that all the way up to the present. And it doesn't mean there are no conflicts, it doesn't mean there's no competition, but I see a more dynamic relationship between these different histories. And it's interesting in thinking about this event that the Caribbean really does play a huge role in that, in terms of, islands and archipelagos. I wasn't thinking in archipelagic terms. I'm still not really yet, though you will see what happens. But it was really the Caribbean in relationship here to Europe and then ultimately to North Africa through a figure like Fanon, through figures like Césaire or Schwartzbart coming the other direction, as it were, crossing this oceanic space, making these connections across histories and memories. And to me, that was an inspiring vision. And I think it does bear, at some level, at least, a resemblance to the vision that Ananya, you laid out in introducing the panel, and that I think the organizers of the event have, of a kind of archipelagic, non-despairing sort of form of memory and of connection across sometimes very clearly dug in identity categories and groups. I could stop there maybe for now.
Thanks for that. Really helpful, I think, theorizing as well. You know, similar problems. I do feel. I saw Vijaya nodding quite a lot. What we know is that you sort of theorized or tried to find a theoretical, you know, grappling. As you said, you come up with some ideas, zero-sum game, etc. And I think that what we could perhaps hear a bit now again from Vijaya is on the ground, you know, when you're working with institutions and claims and desires of different groups, you'd said that you would come back to the idea of indentured labor, you know, just seeing from, you know, from the way a place like Mauritius is, it is extremely multi-everything, you know, there are many different kinds of heritages that people possess. The question is, do you as practitioner, I would call it, of public memory, a creator of institutions, do you go to cater to those individual, you know, claims or different groups, claims of different groups? Do you feel it's your responsibility to pay attention to that? Or did you feel compelled to find some sort of overarching connective tissue for them? I mean, how did you maneuver this space, since you are uniquely involved in the memory claims of both slavery and indentured labor? So we would really, I think this is multidirectionality in praxis. How did you do it?
May I start with an institution that was established by government in 2009, the Mauritius Truth and Justice Commission. So this commission was created to investigate the legacies of slavery at first, and then indenture was added to this mandate, and of course the issue of land ownership and dispossession. So it recruited at that time, I think, some 50 researchers looking at all aspects, or as many aspects as possible, relating to the legacies and consequences of slavery and indenture. And all these past and present discriminations, injustices came to light in these 6 reports, a huge multi-volume report, but unfortunately largely dismissed by those who would have been in charge, or were and are in charge of implementing the 200+ recommendations. But one very important aspect of this work, and this rejoins what you just, the question you just asked me, was the idea of promoting Mauritianness, or the idea, the concept of Mauritianness, but recommending that very strongly, that the historic injustices of the past had to be addressed before this Mauritianness could exist. So though the divisions that had been created as a result of our history, or from our history, could only be overcome if economic and social justice was not also addressed. So this was very important. And Mr. Michel, who had started the reparations movement I talked about earlier, 1960s, when he came to depone before the commission, we're now in the year 2009 and 10, he stated that at the end of the day, even though he had himself been campaigning so much for slave descendants and so on, he said he wanted the situation of all Mauritians at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder to be improved as a result of the commission work, and not just that of ex-slave descendants. So for him, this was a very, very strong statement to make. It rejoins what Michael was just saying. You see the convergence of 2 battles, in a sense, for recognition of rights and recognition of histories and recognition of discriminations. They are not necessarily separate, they're not necessarily parallel. So this was a very important statement, and it showed at that time the evolution of the thinking of leaders of historically deprived communities, that they had begun to realize that this is one battle we're fighting. And he had come a long way, I would say, to acknowledge that our colonial past has made many victims, slavery, but also other victims. When you look at the histories of land, ownership and distribution, we had a mass of researchers looking at some 300+ cases. And the conclusion was almost every group, whether it's ethno-cultural group, had been dispossessed of land at some point or the other. It was not limited to one group. So you can read the report. I'm not going to go into that in detail. So rather than having or continuing to promote these parallel histories, the Truth and Justice Commission recommended that public and private institutions promote the idea that Mauritians should consider their history and their heritage as we've been talking about, shared history and shared heritage. And Ananya and Shivani, I know you've stated in your concept paper for the conference, archipelagic memory should not only emanate from culturally contingent or politically constructed ideas. So that's, I think, there is a continuity in the thinking. But related to this, I hope I'm not going on too long, we must not forget the economic side of things, the economic powers that exist behind all this cultural competition. And this is the experience I have had personally. There's also the economic competition that exists. And one example, coming to the abolition of slavery and the commemoration of Le Mon Mountain as a World Heritage Site. In the 1990s, I fought against a project to build a cable car on top of this historic mountain. There were only 3 of us fighting this project. We did not get any help or support except from the media. And even those who we expected, the support of groups that would be directly concerned, they were actually not interested, and some even aligned with the commercial promoters. Another example now, we're talking of indenture. There's a project to construct a metro station and a multi-story office and shopping complex right in front of the Archipelagic World Heritage Site. If this project goes ahead, it'll completely disfigure, block all the historic views of this whole area, which used to be called the Eastern Suburb, peopled by people of Indian, Chinese, Afro-Malagasy descent. So here, the same story is being repeated. 2022, promoters are unashamedly promoting ethnic politics to advance a commercial project. So when we are studying archipelagic memory, I don't think we can ignore these very hard facts and realities of local politics in our countries.
I think you're absolutely right to sound that warning note, because in a sense, I'll take us back. When you were talking, I was remembering the essay by Epeli Haufa, Our Sea of Islands, where he also makes a very strong case for using the idea of the Sea of Islands, which is inherently archipelagic, to say that these small islands are not to be left at the mercy of neoliberal, globalization and power coming from elsewhere just because they are small, but the same kind of neocolonial attitude can, of course, emanate from commercial-minded interests within these islands, as you're pointing out. So the question is, memory, how does one safeguard memory? And I think or why does one even need to, what is the value of having time, space, and resources devoted to memorialization rather than commercialization, building over, etc. And here I think in this awareness that you feel such a situation demands, 3 of you banded together, to mount an opposition to this. And I'm sure if we go into details, we will not find any kind of ethno-religious, demographic, racial particularity drawing the 3 of you together. It was probably some other consideration. That is exactly, again, an archipelagic connection, And here I would like us to come to the sense then of Michael's new, new idea of the implicated subject, because I think it, after giving us multi-directional memory, I think Michael, wasn't going to let us rest. He came up with another extremely useful a useful concept to take further the idea of multidirectionality into this idea of implication, that there should be a way, as you say, Michael, in that book, for us to have a vocabulary to think about, for example, the difficult legacy of perpetrators. There are all kinds of peoples who set forth descendants into the world, who now inhabit the same spaces of memorialization. So whose memory is it anyway, Michael, maybe you would like to tell us how you've found the idea of implication perhaps a useful tool to again move through these very complex ideas and difficult spaces?
Yeah, I'll give it a try. Again, it's the specificity of the Mauritian situation is such that it's hard for me. I've been, again, learning so much, but it's hard for me to. I can't address it directly. Of course, that's not my job anyway. I don't think, but it's inspiring to learn more about it. I came to this notion of implication after finishing multidirectional memory, and there and I think this will be relevant, or I hope it will be relevant also for the Mauritian context. What I was especially interested in that earlier book, Multidirectional Memory, was really the intersecting legacies of what you could call histories or experiences of victimization, right? So it was really kind of looking at things from the victim perspective, or legacies of victimization, not always direct victims. And that's what the kind of connections Gilroy was trying to make as well, I think, across Black Jewish histories, right? Histories of suffering. But I started to become interested in how people who are not either victims or aligned with victims genealogically or otherwise, how they also relate to a multiplicity of histories of the sort that interests all of us, I think. And I realized that we were lacking some key terms in vocabulary. It seemed to me we were lacking some key vocabulary. We have the incredibly important work, which I think is relevant here, of Mariana Hirsch, of post-memory, which has to do with the intergenerational transmission of, again, experiences of trauma coming out of a Holocaust context, but very explicitly in her work and others who picked it up, cutting across different histories as well. So we can talk about post-memories of slavery, et cetera, of various sorts of traumatic histories. So I think that's incredibly useful on the side of the victims, as it were. But what about the other side, right? Does intergenerational transmission among perpetrators or even beneficiaries of historical violence work the same way as post-memory? It seemed to me, both for like intellectual reasons, but also sort of morally and ethically, we needed a different term, that we shouldn't collapse those different legacies together, though they can be very entangled. I can say more about that in a moment. So my notion of the implicated subject is precisely a way to name people and groups who are not themselves direct perpetrators of violence or agents of exploitation, but who benefit from it, who inherit it in some way as members of a particular nation or other group, who help perpetuate it in different ways as well, again, without being direct perpetrators. And I found this useful both thinking historically, how does someone like me, a white American, inherit these histories of slavery and indigenous dispossession, which no one in my family could possibly have participated in because we immigrated, at a much later stage. And yet, despite that, I can't claim any kind of innocence, right? I am implicated in these histories. I benefit from them. But I'm also interested, and this might connect to some of the things that Vijaya was mentioning as well, also in a kind of synchronic present day way, that we are all in various circuits of global capitalism, for example, in which we don't necessarily participate directly, but we perpetuate and we benefit from these structures of inequality and exploitation. So it seems to me that in the, from what I'm hearing about the Mauritian context, what I've been reading, a useful term might be one that I develop in the book, which is that of complex implication, which is a recognition that many of us, in fact, have lines of connection both to histories of perpetration and to histories of victimization, right? So again, as a Jewish American, I have a strong consciousness of a long history of anti-Semitism, of the proximity of the Nazi genocide, even though most of my family was not directly involved in that, but you inherit a certain sense of this history of trauma and victimization. But at the same time, as I was saying a moment ago, as a white American, as a US citizen, right, as a diasporic Jew who is interpolated by the state of Israel for their projects of occupation, right, we have multiple connections to these histories, and that part of the difficulty, and I think a lot of the conflict and competition often comes out of those complex relations that we have to different histories of violence, right? And so it's what I don't have solutions to this, but what I try to do with my work is to provide at least categories and vocabulary that might help us sort out some of those complexities. Because I do feel if we can get people to see that they are kind of multiply situated in relationship to these histories as potentially descendants of victims, but also beneficiaries of other forms of exploitation or violence, that can be a starting point for making connections across groups. I guess that's the way I would put it. But mostly what I try to do as a scholar is to try to provide vocabulary and conceptual categories that I hope will then be useful in different contexts.
I think that that's exactly what we're trying to do here, Michael. We are trying to see if we are trying to develop, as you have tried to do in your own way, vocabularies for connecting different situations so that we can all galvanize, our separate approaches and energies into thinking together about issues which, frankly speaking, are pretty pressing across the board: issues of solidarity, of reparation, of decolonization, decolonial praxis. So I think that this is a conversation. We are not going to be solving anything today. We are opening the door. But Vijaya, maybe, and speaking of opening the doors, we do have to start closing down the conversation as well and opening up to questions. Maybe while we move towards some kind of a sense of wrapping up, Vijaya, Michael ended very poignantly on his own positionality, I think, as a subject of complex implication. Would it be putting you too much on the spot to ask you how, in all your years of working very counterintuitively as a person bearing an Indian name, with an Indian distinct Indian heritage in the Mauritian landscape, you chose to step out into the world of thinking about memorializing slavery, where even the people of those communities were afraid to say anything about that. And now, as your career moved, you came back to the idea of thinking about just commemoration of the history that some people would say that's yours. How do you, as a Mauritian person, feel yourself situated? Complexly implicated, maybe, to use Michael's term?
That would be a long story, which we'll leave for another time, why I got interested in the history of slavery. But I have to say that in Mauritius, no one has really questioned my interest in the history of slavery. But I did go to Réunion Island, and someone quite, I'd say, crudely said, "But you're a person of Indian origin, why are you interested in our history?" Mm-hmm. So I said, well, the only answer I had was I'm a global Mauritian. As most Mauritians are, we have multiple identities. Yeah. But I wanted, in relation to this, I wanted to talk, just to refer very quickly to what Michael said about his own situation and the representation of perpetrators on the question of slavery here, for example. As you know, we're setting up a slavery museum. And this is a question that gets discussed so often. How do you represent slave owners? How do you represent slaves? And unfortunately, in the Mauritian public image, we have a lot, as Ananya knows, we have a lot of stereotypes about who are slave owners and who are the slaves. Mauritius has been a cosmopolitan society from the very beginning. Slave owners were of all shapes, hues, and colors. They were not all white. Slaves were also of Asian, Chinese, and African and Malagasy origin, although the majority, of course, were Afro-Malagasy. And so this is something that seems difficult for some Mauritians to accept, that, you have this, in the Truth and Justice Commission, we had one family coming to depot and said, well, you haven't talked about the Indians who came to Mauritius in the 18th century. You're focused only on indenture. So I said, of course, we're more than happy to go into that. We'll have a chapter in the report on it. And then we talked a little bit more about the history of Indians who had come in the 18th century. Some had come as slaves and others were slave owners. And so when this part of the history started becoming known, they said, well, forget it, we're not interested. So there is this image or this memory of who we are or what history represents, which still hasn't yet been accepted. The idea of putting the names of slave owners on the walls of the Slavery Museum is a huge subject of debate. And when we say that the majority of slave owners were not white, they were actually of Indian, African, or Malagasy descent, this is again something of debate. Should we show this? So I think we have a long way to go. but just to say a little bit about my own, I lived perhaps in Kenya for many years, so that sparked my interest in African history, and coming to Mauritius, of course, researching the history of slavery seemed logical, but there was a huge gap in the archives on the situation of slaves after abolition. Today, we're commemorating the abolition. There's actually very little known about what happened to the ex-slaves after the abolition of slavery. As historian, we've created a momentum for commemoration of events, abolition of slavery, arrival of indentured laborers. We have the slave route. The Mauritian government started the indentured labor route project. And we often used ethno-cultural considerations to support heritage dossiers that went before UNESCO. But in doing so, we have also helped to create fragmentation, and scholars have been as responsible for this as public or economic interests or whatever. Le Monde village is one example of this. We have now created a fragmented community where there used to be one village before wanting to protect their mountain. One official, I won't mention which institution, told me that only real Creoles should participate in events concerning commemorating slavery. Today, this it means that the rest of the village are no longer involved in these events. So these are facts. We tend to forget facts that our history is cosmopolitan from the beginning. We have created ethnic profile for a Maroon or for a slave descendant or for a slave owner. But this image needs to be completely deconstructed now by scholars and researchers. So I'm personally moving away from the heritage focus and trying to go back to redress, to redirect our energies to uncovering the truths about history and making them much more known.
Well, I think that's a wonderful forward-looking, perhaps, note to start closing our tripartite conversation on and opening up to questions which I know are already there. And the note you ended on actually reminded me of your very fine essay on Port Louis as a cosmopolitan city, where you detail all these things that you've been telling us about are recognized elements from that essay. People, please go and read it. And I think also your other essay on the breaking the wall of silence, slavery in Mauritian historiography, where you end with a very poignant sentiment: for how much longer can we remain an island? That's the final question you ask rhetorically in that essay. So people, please, along with Michael's books, Vijaya's works are also out there for you to acquaint yourself more, better with what they've been talking about today. I think really that that image of fragmentation is our cue to move past that kind of almost inevitable of logic. When you start looking closely at people's claims, we kind of almost zoom in so closely that we lose the sense of, again, that which connects. And archipelagic memory, I feel, is one way of trying to say, from fragments, we can connect. Indeed, the work that Ari Gauthier and I do together, we do use that very phrase, archipelago of fragments, all the time. And I think we use it in many ways, but this is a good example of how it could actually seem illustrative of a conundrum, which is nevertheless also a way forward. And I think there's a small conclusion in Fabienne Viala's very important book on the post-Columbus syndrome, Identities, Cultural Nationalism and Commemoration in the Caribbean. And Fabienne Viala ends that book, which is looking at how Columbus is commemorated in different Caribbean islands. And she ends with a conclusion titled Archipelagic Memory. And there she comes to the conclusion that this phrase for her is something to look forward to. And she hopes that in the Caribbean, different islands who are perpetuating in a way a nation memory, a national memory around Columbus, can somehow move away towards a supranational way of thinking about the ultimately a shared past. Therefore, for her, archipelagic memory could be a reparative and connective, move. This is our challenge, to take those fragments, like Derek Walcott's vase, which is shattered, nevertheless it's put together. So we are not trying to hide those fragments, but can we have some sort of a wholeness which is not this kind of continental kind of a wholeness, like Matthew Arnold feels we are part of a single continent. That's not the point. Can we be whole somehow, like a sea of islands? And I think archipelagic memory, which teaches us, in Glissant's words, to remember possible futures, perhaps is the way to go. And I'm going to end my commentary, my response to what the wonderful and illuminating, glimpses you both have given us into your work and into your thoughts, with a little quote from Shanaz Patel, who is a Mauritian author, from her book, her novel on Chagos, on this island, which is at the heart of geopolitics of the Indian Ocean. And there, one of her characters says, Zil in ferme, that's Creole, of course, the island is closed. Her island is closed. And this is like because the Chagos is closed because of the occupation now, and the ship cannot go back. These Chagosians are marooned in a way on Mauritius, the island of Mauritius. And the person says, the character says, island is closed. What was that supposed to mean? That it was a restaurant, the office of, it's an office, how can you close off an island? So I think for me, what we want to do with archipelagic memory is think about the island that is actually open and use this as a model, as a trope. Archipelagic memory doesn't have to only think about actual archipelagos and islands. We can take it as a structure and import it to other complex, implicated situations. But the main thing is to think about the sea, which is history, that's Derek Walcott's words, but perhaps then the archipelago, which is memory. So on that note, I'm going to say thank you again to both of you for flagging us off on our shared journey. There are questions, I know. I believe that our efficient team is going to guide us through them. So maybe Luca, Shivani, Elvin, you will tell us what to do next with the questions. And thank you again, Michael and Sarah.
Hello. Thank you very much, Vijaya, Michael, and Ananya, for this intriguing conversation. We are indeed receiving questions, so we're sort of going through them. And I will start by, since we were sort of to honor the upvoting function of Zoom webinar, I will ask the question, a question that seems to have sort of attracted quite some interest. Which has been asked by Isha Seal. And I think that can also sort of have all of you contribute in the discussion, in the answer. So Isha is wondering about the possibility of a dialogic exchange between archipelagic memory, which we are exploring here, post-memory, and post-amnesia, and she's specifically referring to Ananya's theorization of post-amnesia in her work. So archipelagic memory, post-memory, and post-amnesia, and their dialogic exchange. And she's wondering what might be the effective import of such a dialogue for the creolization of public memory, which is where I think Vijaya probably would also have something to say. And the notion of the complexly implicated subject that Michael speaks of. So I think it's really a point of discussion for all of us. If I was clear enough, if you want, I can read it again. So the possibility of a dialogic exchange between archipelagic memory, post-memory, and post-amnesia, and what this dialogue what is the effective import of this dialogue for the creolization of public memory and the notion of the implicated subject? You're free to start. Whoever wants to start.
Take it away, Ananya.
Thanks, folks. Well, it is a very massive question, of course, but we don't have to, as I said, solve all the problems of the world today. It's interesting that people are thinking that all these terminologies that we have we have coined in our own ways to deal with similar or somewhat divergent problems can perhaps be put into dialogue with each other. I mean, for me, I coined the word post-amnesia because when I started to work through post-memory in the context of South Asia and the impact of the partition of 1947 and the emergence of Bangladesh in 1971, and I realized that maybe post-memory was not as appropriate as post-amnesia because people had deliberately forgotten a lot of things. So there was the acts of forgetting were very systematic, and so I remember writing to Mariana first and saying, I'm going to use post-memory, I hope it's okay. And then I said, actually, I'm going to use post-amnesia, I hope that's okay. So, you know, we sometimes adjust our ideas, but I think that what's most telling for me is what Isha really talks about at the end of a comment, which is the creolization of public memory. Now, Manuela Boatka, a colleague in Freiburg, has been using the idea of creolization in very many theoretical ways. She's talking about the, for example, creolization of the idea of Europe, you know, creolization of, and even I think Françoise Léonet has also talked about creolizing theory itself, you know. So maybe we can think about a public memory which is creolized, both in a descriptive way, but also in a kind of performative way. I don't know whether Vijaya may want to play with that idea a bit from the perspective of Mauritius, the very creolized.
I'm not sure I quite understand the concept of creolized memory. If you're trying to look at from an island perspective, I know here for these many years, we've been trying to devise a sort of conceptual and theoretical framework based on what we feel are Mauritian interests, historical interests, etc., rather than accepting models and theories that have been, I suppose this is what is meant by that. Is it, I don't know, a local version or a indigenous version of memory or theorization of memory? I don't know, that of course, that I would agree, but as we've seen in our very fragmented societies, that will be up to the researchers. I think that's the responsibility of researchers to devise, like what you're doing with Tinai Creole and so on, which is really, I think you've really hit on something really very important and which needs to become much more, I wouldn't say official, I don't want to go into official memory, but really, I think it'd be great if you could, I know we're talking of the future, but some kind of a observatory, I don't know if you can call it that, a cultural observatory where you, because I think that we're very much responsible for what we say as researchers and how what we say is used or misused by others. And that creates also this memory. I don't know if you're getting my gist, but I think we do have a responsibility of monitoring how our words and our actions are used or reused.
No, absolutely. I think we feel, I mean, these are all terms that are up for grabs by us, you know, so I don't think, again, even we have a sense of what might be the creolization of memory. And as I was saying, it worked on many different levels. I mean, we can talk about Mauritius being a creolized island, and therefore memory, by definition of a creolized island, should be creolized as well. But, you know, it could also be about what exactly, it could be a way of thinking about complexly implicated subjects as well. And in a way, trying to get away from this essentialization. I think the word creolization, the idea creolization for me is most useful in steering us away from essentialism, and that could be a pathway. But Michael, I don't know if you had any responses to that quite open question, really.
Yeah, I'll come in on a couple of points. I don't think it answers the question, but you know, in terms of the creolization of memory, I mean, in some ways, my argument would be that memory is always already creolized. That sounds too easy, but there's something to it, which is that, because for me, memory is always social. And it's the sociality of memory that implies and leads to ultimately a kind of creolization, that even memories that seem intimately our own are actually emerged from our dialogic relationships, first within the family and then within wider spheres, right? So even our most intimate personal memories are always in some sense creolized, I think, because they're social, right? And as we get into larger groups, I think that remains true and maybe even becomes more true. But at the same time, we also run into trouble. And I wanted to go back to, you know, what I think was a really important point from Vijaya earlier, if I understood her correctly, that sometimes memory work in the present can actually have the opposite effect, right? Which is not to move us toward greater creolization or understanding or whatever, but rather to fragment and to kind of push people even further into boxes and islands, if you will, and group identities and ethnicization and all this sort of thing. And even though, right, I'm a scholar of memory, my work is premised on the ethical potentials of memory to create new forms of solidarity, but I think you also have to recognize that there are limits to what memory can do. And maybe memory isn't always the solution. And so I took what Vijaya said earlier as an argument for sometimes, we need to get the history right first, right? We need the kind of work of historians to give us a more complex vision of the past, which then we might want to re-import into memory discourses and see if we can do that. And it does seem to me, again, just from what I'm learning, that a lot of the issue is really about redistribution and not just about recognition, to use those two terms. So if memory is sort of on the side of recognition, I would say here, maybe simplifying, it seems like a lot of the problems have also to do with questions of redistribution, of inequalities in the present that may be tied to the past, probably are tied to the past, but also in very complicated ways that you can't so easily sort out and put into boxes. So, I guess it's a plea just to say that memory isn't always the solution. It can be, it should be, I'd like it to be, but it isn't always. And that we have to work on different planes at the same time and think about these different categories. When we're talking about reparation, that is I think a really important all-encompassing term for me, which includes both questions of recognition, healing, what have you, but also questions of redistribution, of material redistribution. So yeah, that's sort of what strikes me there. I know it doesn't quite answer the question, but.
I just want to say, Michael has just expressed my own feelings much better than I did. So.
Well, this is a good conversation when that happens. So I know there are other questions which are getting upvoted. Shall we take another one maybe?
Yes, question from one attendee, Faisal Maruki. So I read his question. To link Vijaya Teelock's perception of history in the sense of whose is history and who writes history, and Michael Rothberg theorization of multidirectional memory, how can one accommodate such competing memories as the Holocaust and the Palestinian Nakba, not only on a theoretical plane, but also taking into account settlers, colonial realities, and the ongoing strife?
I think this question dovetails beautifully into what you were just saying, Michael. And perhaps you would like to maybe continue on that.
I can say a couple of words. I mean, again, I can't solve the problem here theoretically or in our Zoom conversation, but it's something I've written about in my essay From Gaza to Warsaw, which was, I think, the first or one of the very first things that I wrote after the book, when I was getting a lot of questions, including from our friend Steph Krapps, about, okay, multidirectionality of memory, but how do you distinguish between different forms of multidirectional memory? Is multidirectional memory always good, etc.? These kinds of questions, and they seem to me very legitimate questions, and I didn't feel I had adequately addressed them in the book, though I think I addressed them to some degree. And so I took up precisely that question of sort of Nakba Holocaust comparison as a way of trying to work through this very problem. And, just to make a long story short, and I don't know if this will fully address all aspects of the question, but I mean, what I came to see is that, yes, there are in fact different varieties of multidirectional memory, and that we can map them, that it's helpful to map them out a bit and to make certain kinds of distinctions. And what I found, and so I ended up mapping them on two axes, if I could do this. An axis of what I called comparison, which sort of goes between equation on the one hand and differentiation on the other hand. And that's sort of how I had distinguished things in the book itself. Like here's a discourse or a memory that collapses different histories together. Here's one that accepts certain differences. And I think that's important, but I found it inadequate in the long run, because the next question is, well, why are we comparing? What's the point of comparing? And that's what I call the axis of political affect, which runs from sort of competition to solidarity. And once you have those two axes, you can start to map things out. And I think it's true that in many contexts, but certainly in the Israeli-Palestinian one, what you often get is articulations, certainly on the side of competition, but sometimes when there's solidarity also on the side of equation, right? Like you suffered, we suffered, these are the same, we put them together. Those things are real, they happen, they're articulated, that we can't stop people from making those kinds of statements. The sort of vision that I hold out, a hopeful vision, is the one of what I call differentiated solidarity, which can recognize that there are connections across these different histories. They don't have to be collapsed, but they don't have to be collapsed into the same. They don't have to be equated in order to generate forms of solidarity. And in the Israeli-Palestinian case, they're sometimes hard to find, but I actually think someone like Edward Said is, in fact, offers such a vision, right? When he talks about Palestinians, for example, as the victims of the victims, I don't think it's an equation there, but rather a recognition that those who are responsible for the occupation and dispossession of Palestinians today themselves do have a history of victimization as well, and that the situation therefore is complicated morally and in some ways politically. So I think there are such possible visions. I don't know, Luca, have I missed important aspects of the question though that you'd want to bring back? Or does that get us somewhere at least?
I think it gets us, again, as you say, we cannot satisfy ourselves on these deep, ethically, all-encompassing issues.
Yeah, and just to like connect back to what I said a moment ago, I mean, again, the answer isn't going to come in the realm of memory. The answer comes in the realm of decolonization, right? And reparation, and finding some sort of political framework that is, I would say, binational, federative, whatever it is. And there again, I think then the questions of memory do come back. And we do need some forms of creolized, in order to make that political framework work, there will need to be some kind of creolized, multi-directional memory framework. But the memory alone isn't going to do it. There have to be, again, material, concrete political transformations on the ground, of course.
I think that might bring us quite nicely to the next upvoted question that I think Shivani is going to ask, because these are really also about things we see on the ground or don't see, right? And it's something for Vijaya, I do believe.
Yeah, thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, Ananya. So this question is from another Vijaya, Teelock. So Teelock with a U, not with an O. And she says, when I visit Mauritius, I'm very surprised that one cannot sense the history of slavery in Mauritius. Yet so many references, physical and non-physical, of its colonial past. So she means that there are many references to the colonial past of Mauritius. Do you think that this contributes to Mauritians not knowing the true history? She's putting those, that word between inverted commas.
Well, I'm happy to know there's somebody else with my name, but I'd like to see them. Yes, I think I'm coming back again to the Truth and Justice Commission report, which had a very, very long section on memorialization of slavery. And for example, one of the recommendations was that in front of all the sugar estates, there were at that time, during the days of slavery, 118 sugar estates who possessed, owned hundreds of slaves, that there should be at least a plaque or something giving the names of all the slaves that had worked on that plantation. We recommended the creation of a slave museum. So this is one recommendation that is being implemented. So there were a host of recommendations made to make the history of slavery better known in Mauritius. So some of it is being implemented and others have been completely ignored, unfortunately. But there's a lot written on the history of slavery in Mauritius. We have quite a prolific not just academic, but popular writing on slavery. So maybe visit the bookshops and have a look at them.
I think it is.
Can I just...
Sorry, go on, Shivani.
I was just actually going to ask another question myself on this issue. With the Truth and Justice Commission recommendations, who are they addressed to, and whose responsibility is it to feel that they are addressed to them? Who does something about these recommendations?
The recommendations were, the report itself was submitted to the President of the Republic, who passed it on to the Parliament at the National Assembly. And then this was distributed to all the ministries and concerned. But the spirit of the Truth and Justice Commission is what those who were in charge of implementing the report didn't quite understand, because the point was to get the population involved in the implementation of the recommendations. Participatory democracy, we felt, was really, really important. Civil society needs to be involved in the implementation. And unfortunately, this did not happen. It was left to civil servants and to implement. And that's partially one of the reasons why so many of the recommendations were not implemented or not understood. So importance of having civil society involved in it.
If I may just say, just add to my observations of memorialization topographies in Mauritius, an island I have been visiting for a while now, and it has taught me a lot. I think it is perhaps what the other Vijaya means is that, I mean, for example, the one big visible site is, of course, Le Morne, to slavery. But it is quite off route. You have to really have an agenda you can't just like stroll around the waterfront of Cordon and just pop into the indentured labor, into Upper Vasi Ghat, for example. I mean, certain things are more like there. And I mean, or you can go to Eureka or these places where there are obvious, the grand houses of the plantations have now been converted. So maybe that's what she meant. But I think there are so many scales on there of memorialization. And I think what you're saying is that there is an impetus, there's a need for memorialization to kind of trickle down and not just be present in these large sites that one visits from whichever part of the island to another, but somehow implicated in the day-to-day lives of people, and they should be participating in this process. So I think that is the bigger challenge, perhaps.
Making it more visible, definitely. But just to refer to your last statement about the Upper Vasi Ghat being in a public space, this is where the Future Slavery Museum is located, right next to Upper Vasi Ghat.
That's right.
And so it's to create this cultural continuum or the historical continuum, not to separate them.
Yeah.
So this is an important decision, I feel.
Absolutely, and I'm looking forward to returning to Mauritius to experience that contiguity, physically. And I'm sure the other Vijaya, Teelock, will also, feel that when we all are able to return to Mauritius as outsiders. I think we had at least one. We must think about the time. Committee, organization committee. Tell us where are we going?
Yes, the clock is striking 6, which is what pretty much what we were. Where we were saying we would stop. I wonder, should we stop here?
You can ask one more question.
One more question.
Yeah. We had the one from Green about French Caribbean.
Okay. Yeah. Maybe let's take a question that takes us. Well, it doesn't take us back because we were already talking about islands precisely now with Vijaya and Mauritius, but it's taken us to other islands, islands with which Michael maybe is also more familiar. The French Caribbean. And also I think this question takes us back to Ananya's introduction, specifically, and also end, I think, of her, when she was referring to Fabienne Viala's book on post-Columbus syndrome, and that chapter on precisely on archipelagic memory, and how archipelagic memory, if I'm not mistaken, if I remember correctly for her, is something to hope for more than something that does reflect the current reality of French Caribbean islands. And I think Sandrine is sort of is connecting here, right? Exactly when she asks Vijaya, but I think Michael as well, and of course Ananya. She's wondering about what it might take for French Caribbean islands to further develop their current attempt at implementing an indentured labor route. And she sees that this project is currently stalling in Guadeloupe, for instance. So did the indentured labor route project in Mauritius bring about more fragmentation of communities or memory of the communities along ethnic lines, or are simply such fragmentations to be acknowledged as somehow unavoidable drawbacks? Here is where I think also Michael can sort of come in, not maybe on the specifics of the Caribbean island situation, as also neither should Vijaya, but sort of taking their own views about on the one hand, what the ILR project in Mauritius brought about, and what do we do with this fragmentation of memory when we try to sort of create such a project, specifically memorializing.
Well, first the indentured labor route project was inspired from the slave route project, which had existed since 1994. And many people from the indentured diaspora, Caribbean and the Indian Ocean Islands, felt they would also like some kind of a network that would link artists, scholars, so a lot of the works could be shared, conferences could be held, and so on. But in the implementation of the indentured labor route project, we have also discussed the success or limited success that each country belonging to the IRRP has had, and the fragmentation that this person talks about. Cultural fragmentation in the Caribbean seems to be much more intense than it seems to be in the Indian Ocean. I think maybe in Mauritius we have, I don't want to flatter our governments or whatever, but I think in terms of cultural management, the situation does not seem as acute as it seems to be in, for example, Trinidad or Guyana. For example, in Guyana, we could not find a historian of indenture living in Guyana. They're all overseas. So this for us was a problem. So there is a competition, but there it seems to be skewed in the other direction compared to Mauritius. But again, I'll repeat it again, as researchers, we all have a responsibility to monitor how our works are used. Sometimes what we write or what I write is being misused by others who have other agendas. And we really have to have this very strong, I know many researchers don't like getting involved in, how do you call it, activism, but you really have a responsibility to make sure, you can't make sure, but at least monitor what is happening to your works and your words.
I'm on mute. Michael, maybe you want to just add a few words there.
Yeah, a few, maybe just a few words of sort of closing or what have you. I can't really address the question specifically, though it's interesting to hear from Vijaya that, you know, the way that the indentured route sort of emerged from the slave route, which again, that would be an example of the kind of multi-directionality, I suppose, that I'm interested in, or that I've talked about. I mean, I think so just maybe to think for a moment again about the archipelagic vision. You know, it's an incredibly appealing vision, and I guess I take it sort of in a, maybe from, I don't know if this is directly from Glissant or Glissant-esque language, but something like, it's a vision of something like relationality without unity, is one phrase I wrote down. And another one was locality without closure. And, you know, I think this is what we want. In some ways, I think we have it, but we have to make it visible. But I also think we have to create it. So I think there has to be, you know, sort of archipelago as a methodology is really important too. And I think this is what you guys are doing in your project, and even in a small way, maybe in staging this conversation, but creating networks that will embody that sort of relationality without unity, that will bring together different localities and recognize the very particular material charged issues that always exist in any given locality, but not to take that as the last word, not to close out the discussion through appeal to the local and the particular, but to try to relay that locality and that specificity back into conversation, in a network, in a relation, in a larger dialogue, in a larger conversation, without trying to unify all those different fragments, but to recognize their specificity, but also, again, to me, really important, their relationality. And it's only from that we're going to get any kind of useful solidarity visions. And I guess final thought is, I think civil society does seem really important to me. If you look at the German case, which is a complicated one, I don't want to open up that whole thing right now, but what happened in the 1980s was a grassroots movement of discovering and making visible memories at a very local level, of really digging in the earth and saying, we need to mark this spot. This was the Gestapo headquarters, or this was a place where Jews lived before they were deported to the camps. Marking those sorts of localities and doing it with this sort of grassroots activist buy-in. And so not so much trickling down, as I think maybe someone said a moment ago, but actually what you really want is for memory to trickle up, to emerge from the ground and start to infiltrate the centers of power. How you do that, I don't know, but I think that's the vision and that's the aim of this kind of project.
That's been really inspiring, actually, and a wonderful place, I think, to definitely to finally bring this very lively and an open discussion to some sort of necessary momentary close. Because yes, like you, Michael, I have been quite always impressed by this hands-on memorialization that we see in a city like Berlin, for example. And perhaps that is actually to give somehow civil society, to infuse civil society with a certain kind of confidence that matters can indeed be taken into one's own hands. But those sorts of everyday relationalities we practice in communities, we do. However antagonistic the public voice from those communities may come out at certain moments, actually on a day-to-day level, I think we are always relational and supportive and archipelagic. So that methodology is what I think on the level of praxis and theorizing and working on these issues together, I hope we are on this journey together. This was just a starting point. There's so many amazing questions. We simply can't get into all of them, but they are very deep and all of them are relational one way or the other. So thank you to this audience for engaging with us. I'm going to hand it over to the organizers to bring the matter to a formal close.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Michael, Vijaya, Ananya. First of all, you've been joining us from very different time zones, but you joined us and took the time to open up a long-awaited for intellectual conversation, and we have learned so much from you. And we just want to thank everyone for their participation and for their support today. And we invite everybody to keep watching the archipelagic memory space, which is growing every day. And until our next meeting, we would like to say, stay safe and stay well. Take very good care and see you hopefully in August in Mauritius.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank
you to the organizers. You did a marvelous job.
you. Thank you so much.